6 months ago, during my third round of chemotherapy for stage 3 lymphoma here in Portland, Oregon, I was too weak to sit up without feeling like gravity itself had doubled. The treatments at Willamette Oncology Center had stripped me down to something unrecognizable. Food tasted like metal, my skin felt like paper stretched too tight over bone, and even lifting my phone off the nightstand required planning and a rest break afterward. I had always been the steady one in our marriage, the one who fixed things, carried groceries, stayed late at work, handled the unexpected. Suddenly I could not even hold myself upright in bed. That was the morning Lauren stood in the bedroom doorway with her Pilates bag slung over her shoulder. She did not step fully into the room. She did not sit beside me. She did not ask how I was feeling after the infusion the day before. She stayed near the frame like she was already halfway out the door. Without looking at me, she said, "I didn't marry you to be your nurse. I can't live like this." Her voice was flat, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced saying it in the car. I remember the way the light from the hallway cut across the carpet between us. I remember trying to swallow and realizing my mouth was too dry to form words. I physically could not respond. My chest tightened, but not in a dramatic way, more like something quietly collapsing inward. After she left for the gym, I reached for my phone with hands that trembled from both chemo and shock, opened the Notes app, and typed her exact sentence word for word. I did not embellish it. I did not soften it. I saved it because something in me knew I would need to remember that this was real and not some fever dream brought on by medication. After that, she started needing space. That was the phrase she used. Space to process. Space to breathe. Space to not feel overwhelmed. Her gym sessions stretched longer and longer, sometimes 3 hours at a time. Then came the weekend mental health retreats, yoga workshops out near Mount Hood, overnight stays with friends whose names I barely recognized. She framed it as self-care, as survival, as something she had to do to stay strong. Meanwhile I was measuring my day in pill schedules and nausea waves. Technically, Lauren still lived in the house in the Hawthorne district. Her clothes were still in the closet. Her car was still in the driveway most nights. But emotionally, she was already gone. Conversations became logistical. Did I need groceries? What time was my appointment? Had the insurance paperwork been filed? There was no hand on my shoulder, no sitting beside me during the worst of it, no attempt to pretend this was something we were facing together. My younger sister, Hannah Carter, moved in within a week of that morning. She is 35 and has always been the practical one in our family. She did not announce her arrival with speeches or dramatic promises. She showed up with a suitcase, a stack of freezer meals, and a notebook where she wrote down my medication schedule in careful handwriting. She took over feeding me when I could not stomach solid food. She cleaned the bathroom after I got sick. She drove me to Willamette Oncology Center and sat through the hours of infusion, scrolling quietly on her phone but always close enough that I could see her if I opened my eyes. Hannah slept on the couch at first, then eventually moved into the guest room. She handled laundry, coordinated with my doctor, and learned how to flush the port in my chest without flinching. Lauren would pass her in the kitchen some mornings, exchange a polite hello, and then leave for another session at the studio. It felt like watching two completely different versions of loyalty coexist under the same roof. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the house settle, aware of how thin the walls felt. I could hear Hannah moving around downstairs, probably setting up my medications for the morning. I could hear Lauren's car pulling in late, the engine cutting off, the front door closing softly so she would not wake me. The distance between us was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, controlled, and absolute. And as weak as my body was, that silence weighed on me heavier than any side effect of the chemotherapy ever could. Fast forward 6 months and the landscape of my life looks completely different on the surface. The scans have been clean for 8 weeks. The word remission hangs in the air like something fragile but real. My hair is starting to grow back unevenly, my appetite has returned in cautious waves, and for the first time in half a year I can stand at the stove long enough to cook my own breakfast without feeling like I am about to pass out. The strength is not what it used to be, but it is mine again. I can crack eggs with steady hands. I can carry a pan from the counter to the burner. I can move through my own kitchen without calculating how many steps it will cost me. Lauren noticed the change almost immediately. The moment my body began to look less like a patient and more like the man she married, her tone shifted. She started lingering in the kitchen in the mornings instead of rushing out. She suggested we start taking walks together in the evenings. One Saturday, while I was rinsing dishes, she leaned against the counter and said we should take a day trip to Cannon Beach like we used to, leave early, get coffee on the drive, walk along the shoreline, maybe even take a picture in front of Haystack Rock like we had years ago. She said it with a lightness that felt almost rehearsed, like she was trying to rewind time to a version of us that no longer existed. I remember drying my hand slowly on a dish towel, folding it once, then placing it neatly beside the sink. The kitchen island stood between us, the same island where Hannah had organized my medication trays and lined up anti-nausea pills in small plastic containers. 3 days earlier, I had sat at that very spot with a different kind of paperwork in front of me. I had filed for divorce quietly, without drama, without announcing it to anyone except my lawyer. The envelope had been sitting in the drawer since then, sealed and waiting. When she finished describing the beach and how nice it would be to get back to normal, I opened the drawer, took out the envelope, and slid it across the island toward her. The motion was calm, almost gentle. For a second she looked confused, like she expected tickets or some kind of surprise. She opened it casually, still half smiling, and when she saw the first page her expression did not change right away. She laughed, a short disbelieving sound, and said something about how that was not funny. I did not match her laughter. I just stood there, steady on my own 2 feet, and watched the realization move across her face as she flipped through the pages. The smile disappeared first. Then the color drained from her cheeks. She looked up at me like she was waiting for me to say it was a misunderstanding, that this was some symbolic gesture about starting fresh. I did not offer her that escape. Her defense came quickly, almost in a rush. She said she had been stressed. She said she panicked. She said she had not known how to handle watching me get sick and that anyone would have reacted badly under that kind of pressure. She reduced it to one bad moment, one sentence said in frustration, one period of weakness that should not define an entire marriage. She spoke about fear, about mental health, about how she thought I would not make it and how she did not know how to cope with that possibility. I listened without interrupting her, but inside I was counting days instead of excuses. It was not one moment in a doorway. It was 122 days of choices. 122 mornings where she chose the gym over sitting beside me. 122 nights where she chose distance over presence. 122 opportunities to step closer that she consistently turned into steps away. The sentence she said in the doorway had been the headline, but the real story was written in everything that followed. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady in a way it had not been 6 months earlier. I told her it was not about panic or stress. It was about patterns. It was about who showed up when things were ugly and uncertain. I had survived cancer, but somewhere in those 122 days, the marriage had not survived with me. After I handed her the papers, the air inside the house changed in a way that felt almost architectural, like walls had shifted slightly off their foundations. That same evening, I carried a pillow and a folded set of sheets down the hallway and moved into the guest bedroom. It was not a dramatic exit. I did not slam doors or announce it as some grand gesture. I simply chose a different room and closed the door behind me. The bed in there was smaller, the window faced the side yard instead of the street, and the closet still smelled faintly like the cedar blocks Hannah had placed there months earlier. It felt neutral, which was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I woke up before Lauren and made coffee for myself only. For years I had measured out enough grounds for both of us without thinking, pouring her cup and setting it on the counter the way she liked. That morning I filled a single mug and left the pot half empty. When she came into the kitchen and saw there was none waiting for her, she stood there for a second as if expecting me to apologize for the oversight. I did not. I rinsed my cup and went back to the guest room to start my workday. I stopped doing her laundry. I stopped noticing when her car needed an oil change or when the tire pressure light flickered on. I stopped picking up the specific yogurt she preferred or the gluten-free crackers she liked to snack on at night. At the grocery store, I bought what I eat now, what my body tolerates as it rebuilds itself, and nothing more. The small, invisible acts of partnership that had once defined my routine disappeared one by one, not out of spite but out of clarity. We divided the refrigerator with a strip of painter's tape running down the center shelf. My food on the left, hers on the right. The pantry followed the same logic, each of us claiming our own rows. Even the freezer became a quiet map of separation. We sat down at the kitchen island and calculated the mortgage, $4,280 a month, and agreed to split it evenly at $2,140 each. Utilities were divided the same way. There was no shouting during that conversation, just numbers and bank transfers and a shared understanding that this house was now a structure we both occupied rather than a home we built together. She kept calling my behavior cold. She said it during arguments in the hallway and in softer tones late at night when she would knock on the guest room door and ask if we could talk. She said she did not recognize me anymore, that I had become distant and clinical. From her perspective, the man who once anticipated her needs without being asked had turned into someone who treated her like a roommate with a contract. I listened to her describe it as if I were observing a case study rather than participating in a marriage. I called it boundaries. The word felt solid in my mouth. Boundaries meant I no longer overextended myself for someone who had stepped back when I was at my weakest. Boundaries meant my energy, which had become precious after months of chemotherapy, was spent deliberately. When she cried and accused me of punishing her, I did not raise my voice. I told her punishment implies an attempt to cause pain in return for pain received. What I was doing was different. I was adjusting to reality. She would stand in the doorway sometimes, tears running down her face, insisting that people make mistakes, that fear makes you act out of character, that I was refusing to see the bigger picture. I told her this was the bigger picture. It was not about one sentence spoken in a bedroom doorway. It was about the version of her that emerged when things stopped being easy. Illness stripped me down physically, but it also stripped our marriage down to its core components. What remained was not something I could unknow. Living under the same roof during that transition forced everything into sharp focus. We passed each other in the hallway like cautious strangers. The house in the Hawthorne district, once filled with shared routines and overlapping habits, now operated on parallel tracks that rarely intersected. She saw withdrawal and called it cruelty. I saw consistency and called it self-preservation. This was not revenge. It was acceptance of the evidence in front of me. When things got hard, she showed me exactly who she was, and believing her was the most honest thing I could do for myself. By the second week after I moved into the guest bedroom, the strategy shifted. One evening I came out of the shower and found her waiting in the hallway wearing expensive lingerie I had never seen before, something delicate and obviously new, tags probably removed that same day. The lighting in the house was dim and deliberate, and for a moment it felt like I had stepped into a staged version of our marriage. She leaned against the wall and tried to smile the way she used to when we were first dating, soft voice, slow movements, as if physical intimacy could override the memory of hospital bracelets and infusion chairs. I did not raise my voice or react dramatically. I simply told her that attraction does not survive abandonment, then walked past her and closed the guest room door. Week 3 became about narrative control. Mutual friends began texting me cautiously, asking if everything was okay, saying they had heard Lauren and I had a big fight. That phrasing told me exactly how she was framing it. According to her, it had been one argument blown out of proportion, a misunderstanding fueled by stress. I did not insult her when I responded to people. I kept it simple and factual. I had cancer. She left emotionally and physically for 122 days. I filed for divorce after remission. The tone of the conversations shifted quickly once the timeline was clear. Facts have a way of cutting through softened versions of reality. By week 4, the house smelled like elaborate dinners almost every night. She cooked dishes we had not made in years, recipes from early in our marriage, plated carefully as if presentation itself could restore intimacy. She pulled our wedding albums down from the hallway shelf and spread them across the kitchen island, pausing on photos of us laughing, dancing, holding each other with uncomplicated certainty. She suggested therapy with urgency, saying we owed it to our history. Without asking me, she booked a couples counseling appointment and left the confirmation email open on the shared computer screen as if that would obligate me to show up. I told her therapy only works when both people are unsure. I was not unsure. Week 5 brought coincidence. I had finally regained enough strength to return to the gym, moving slowly, rebuilding muscle that chemotherapy had stripped away. One afternoon I looked up from the treadmill and saw her walking in wearing athletic clothes I had never seen before. She widened her eyes like she was surprised, like the overlap was accidental, and said she had been thinking about joining for months. She chose a machine directly in my line of sight. I finished my workout without acknowledging the performance and left without waiting for her. By week 6, the tone hardened. She began talking about contesting the divorce, about dragging the process out, about how unfair it was that I was making unilateral decisions. Her voice carried an edge I had not heard before, something sharp beneath the desperation. I listened and then calmly reminded her that I had documented my treatment schedule, her absences, and her statements. I mentioned that my sister had lived in the house, had driven me to Willamette Oncology Center, had witnessed the dynamic firsthand. I did not threaten. I simply stated facts again. The anger drained from her face when she realized this was not an emotional bluff but a prepared position. Each week followed a pattern, cycling through seduction, nostalgia, guilt, fear, and finally intimidation. The tactics changed costumes, but the underlying goal remained the same: to pull me back into a version of us that required me to forget what those 122 days revealed. I did not match her intensity. I did not escalate. My response remained steady, almost clinical in its consistency. I am done. Not because I hate her. Not because I want her to suffer. But because when my body was failing and the future was uncertain, she made her choices clearly and repeatedly. Remission gave me my health back. It did not erase my memory. Around week 6, after the threats about contesting the divorce lost their momentum, something in her posture changed. The frantic energy that had fueled the seduction attempts and orchestrated coincidences seemed to burn out. She told me one evening, without theatrics, that she had started individual therapy. She did not frame it as a tactic to win me back. She did not forward me appointment confirmations or leave brochures on the counter. She simply said she had realized she needed to understand why she reacted the way she did when I got sick. At first I absorbed the information cautiously, expecting another angle to reveal itself. But the days that followed felt different. She stopped performing gestures designed to trigger nostalgia. The elaborate dinners disappeared. The wedding albums went back into the hallway closet. The tone in the house shifted from persuasion to something quieter, more reflective. A few days later she asked if we could sit down and talk, not about the divorce logistics but about what happened. She apologized without attaching a request to it. There was no, "if you give me another chance," tacked onto the end, no subtle reminder of our history as leverage. She said she had been selfish. She said that when I was diagnosed, her mind immediately raced to what my illness meant for her life, her routines, her comfort, her future. She admitted that she had focused on what cancer was taking from her instead of what it was doing to me physically and psychologically. She described feeling overwhelmed and then choosing escape because it was easier than sitting beside a hospital bed and facing uncertainty. She did not defend those choices. She named them. Not long after that, she began volunteering twice a week at a cancer support center across town. I know because I saw the pamphlet on the kitchen counter and because she left early on Tuesdays and Thursdays wearing a simple name badge clipped to her shirt. She did not announce it as proof of change. She did not use it in arguments. It seemed less like a performance and more like an attempt to confront what she had avoided. I found myself acknowledging that shift internally, even if I did not praise it out loud. Growth is real when it is consistent and not strategically timed to an outcome. One night she asked me a question that had been hovering between us for weeks. She asked when I stopped loving her. The way she said it was not accusatory. It sounded tired, almost resigned, as if she already suspected the answer would not be kind. I took a moment before responding because I did not want to default to something dramatic. I wanted to be precise. I told her I stopped feeling loved during treatment. Not in the doorway when she said she did not sign up to be a nurse, but in the accumulation of days that followed. In the empty chair beside the infusion recliner. In the long afternoons when Hannah held a bucket while I got sick and Lauren was at a retreat. Love, for me, had always been tied to presence. When presence disappeared, something foundational eroded quietly. Then I told her I stopped loving her when I realized I felt lighter planning to leave than I felt fighting to stay. The moment I met with the lawyer and signed the initial paperwork, I felt a sense of relief that surprised me with its clarity. It was not triumph. It was not anger. It was a reduction of weight. That realization was more honest than any lingering attachment I was trying to preserve out of habit. She listened without interrupting, tears forming but not spilling dramatically. I acknowledged the work she was doing, the therapy, the volunteering, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. I told her I respected that growth. But growth does not rewind time. It does not erase the memory of who showed up and who did not when everything was uncertain. Remission gave me another chance at life. It also gave me the clarity to choose a version of that life where I no longer question whether I am alone in the hardest moments. By the beginning of week 8, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like an office space where two people were finalizing a contract. She signed a lease on a small apartment in the Alberta Arts District, a place she described as walkable and bright, with big windows and a coffee shop downstairs. She told me the move-in date over breakfast in the same tone someone might use to confirm a dentist appointment. There was no tremor in her voice, just a quiet acceptance that the timeline was real. We met with a realtor the following week and listed the house for $689,000. Watching strangers walk through the Hawthorne living room, commenting on the hardwood floors and the natural light, felt surreal. That space had held chemo side effects, arguments, apologies, and months of silence. Now it was described in neutral terms like square footage and resale value. We signed paperwork side by side at the kitchen island that had once divided our groceries down the middle. The conversations were efficient and practical, focused on staging schedules, showing times, and how to split the proceeds. There was no hostility left in the logistics. Only process. As her move-out date approached, the house began to empty in subtle stages. Boxes appeared in the hallway, then stacks of labeled containers near the front door. She packed methodically, separating what she would take from what would be sold or donated. We coordinated truck rentals and utility transfers the way colleagues might coordinate a project deadline. The intensity that had once filled every exchange was gone, replaced by something almost gentle in its finality. One evening, while we were reviewing documents from the realtor, she paused and looked at me in a way she had not for weeks. There was no accusation in her expression, just something unresolved. She said she had always expected that if things ever got this bad, I would fight for us. She said she thought I would argue harder, insist on therapy more aggressively, refuse to let the marriage dissolve. In her mind, love meant resistance, meant struggle, meant refusing to let go even when the other person faltered. I considered her words carefully before responding because this was not a moment for anger. I told her that I had been fighting long before the divorce papers were filed. I had been fighting through chemotherapy sessions, through nausea and bone-deep exhaustion, through the fear that my body might not respond to treatment. I told her that when I was in that hospital chair, watching medication drip into my veins, I needed a partner who was fighting alongside me, not someone retreating into gym sessions and weekend escapes. Then I said the sentence that had been forming quietly for months. You showed me you were not worth fighting for when I was fighting for my life. The room went still after that. She did not argue. She did not try to reinterpret it. I could see the shift in her expression, the moment when the situation stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like consequence. For weeks she had framed my resolve as bitterness, as retaliation for pain. In that instant, she seemed to understand that it was neither. It was alignment between my values and my choices. On her last night in the house, we stood in the nearly empty living room, the echo in the space more pronounced without furniture. There was sadness there, but it was clean, not chaotic. I did not feel triumph. I felt steady. The anger that once flared had long since burned down into something solid and quiet. This was not revenge for the doorway comment or the missed appointments. It was the natural end point of a series of decisions that began when I was at my weakest. As she closed the front door behind her for the last time, I felt the same sensation I had felt when I signed the divorce papers, a lightness that came from no longer negotiating with reality. Remission had given me another chance at my health. Walking away from a marriage that fractured under pressure was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-respect, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt silent in a way that did not weigh on me. A few weeks after she moved into the apartment in the Alberta Arts District, we both ended up at the same coffee shop in southeast Portland, a place where several of our mutual friends tend to gather on Sunday mornings. It was not planned, and it was not avoided. The divorce had already become common knowledge in our circle, but until that moment most conversations about it had happened in separate rooms, through text messages or cautious phone calls. Sitting at the same table brought everything into the open. Someone eventually mentioned the house sale and then, carefully, the divorce. There was that familiar pause that follows a sensitive topic, the kind where people look down at their cups and wait to see who will define the narrative. I felt the instinct to keep it brief and factual, the same way I had for months. Before I could speak, she did. She said clearly, without softening it, that the divorce was her fault. She did not frame it as a misunderstanding or mutual drift. She said she failed me when I was sick, that she handled my cancer poorly, that she prioritized her own discomfort over showing up for her husband. The table went quiet, not in shock but in recognition of the honesty. She did not cry. She did not dramatize it. She just stated it and then took a sip of her coffee like someone who had already made peace with the weight of that sentence. That was the first moment I believed the growth was real. Not because she took blame publicly, but because there was no performance in it. There was no glance in my direction to see if I approved. It sounded integrated, like something she had already said to herself enough times that it no longer required defense. I did not add anything dramatic. I simply nodded and said we both wanted different things now, and that sometimes clarity comes from hard experiences. A few days later, her father called me. His tone was firm but not hostile. He said marriage takes work, that vows are not meant to dissolve when circumstances get difficult. He spoke about endurance, about sticking it out, about how every couple faces seasons that test them. I listened respectfully because I had once called him family. When he finished, I responded calmly. I told him I agreed that marriage takes work. I told him I did not quit when things got hard. I had cancer. I showed up to every appointment, endured every infusion, fought through every side effect because I wanted to live and because I believed in the life we had built. I said that the difficulty in our marriage did not begin with boredom or financial stress. It began with a medical diagnosis that required partnership. I did not walk away from that fight. She did. There was a long silence on the other end of the line after I said that, and eventually he thanked me for being honest. What surprises me most is the absence of anger. Earlier in the process, there were flashes of it, moments when the memory of the doorway comment would surface and sting. Now it feels distant, like a scene from a previous chapter that no longer dictates my mood. I am not bitter when I talk about it. I do not rehearse arguments in my head. I do not hope she regrets it forever. The situation is simply complete. Owning the narrative does not mean repeating it loudly. It means being consistent in how I describe it and refusing to distort it to make anyone more comfortable. I had cancer. She struggled in a way that revealed a gap I could not ignore. We addressed it, we tried to understand it, and ultimately we ended it. There is sadness in that, but there is also relief. When I look back at the last year, I see two parallel recoveries. One was physical, documented in scan results and blood work. The other was emotional, marked by decisions that aligned with self-respect rather than fear of being alone. I am not angry. I am not bitter. I am just finished, and there is a quiet strength in being able to say that without hesitation. We signed the final documents at a law office in downtown Portland on a gray morning that felt appropriately neutral, the kind of sky that does not lean toward storm or sunshine but simply exists without drama. The process itself was procedural and efficient. We sat across from each other at a polished conference table while our attorneys reviewed the settlement terms we had already discussed and revised. The house had sold, the proceeds divided. The accounts were separated. 60 days after filing, the divorce was officially finalized. There was no dramatic pause when the last signature dried. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a legal structure we had built years ago no longer existed. When we walked out to the parking lot, the air was cool and sharp. For a moment we stood beside our separate cars, an awkward space between us that used to be filled automatically with plans for dinner or errands. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically diminished but emotionally exposed. She asked me if I hated her. The question did not sound defensive. It sounded uncertain, like she genuinely did not know what remained inside me. I searched for anger and found none. I told her the truth. I do not feel much of anything anymore. The rage that once flared when I replayed her words in the doorway has dissolved. The disappointment that weighed on me during treatment has thinned out. What remains is clarity, and clarity is not loud. It is steady and almost quiet. Then she asked if I would ever forgive her. That question carried more weight, not because forgiveness would change the outcome but because it spoke to how she sees herself now. I told her I already had. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. It does not require rebuilding what was broken. For me, forgiveness was releasing the constant replay of those 122 days, deciding not to carry resentment forward into a new chapter of my life. It was a decision made for my own peace, not as a gift to her. She nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction. There was sadness in her eyes, but also a kind of understanding that had been absent months earlier. We did not hug. We did not linger. She got into her car and started the engine, and I watched as she pulled out of the parking space and merged into traffic. That was the last time I saw her as my wife. What surprised me most was the absence of loss. I had expected at least a flicker of it, some cinematic rush of memories or second thoughts. Instead, I felt relief, the same steady lightness that had followed me since I first filed the paperwork. It was not relief that she was gone, but relief that I no longer had to question my own worth within a partnership that faltered under pressure. Cancer stripped my life down to essentials. It reduced my world to hospital rooms, blood counts, and the basic hope of waking up the next day. In that stripped-down space, certain truths became unavoidable. Love is not what someone promises when circumstances are comfortable and the future looks predictable. Love reveals itself in hospital chairs, in long drives to treatment centers, in the quiet endurance of fear shared rather than avoided. Love is who stays when it is unbearable. She chose comfort when confronted with uncertainty. I chose to survive, to heal, and ultimately to protect the version of myself that endured those months. Signing those final papers was not an act of anger. It was an acknowledgement of what had already become clear long before the ink dried. As I walked to my car and drove away from that office, the city moved around me in its usual rhythm, traffic lights changing, pedestrians crossing, life continuing without pause. For the first time in a long time, I felt aligned with my own choices. I did not lose a marriage that day. I closed a chapter that had already ended, and in doing so, I chose myself.